And the first question in the name of the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, does he stand by his statement regarding first home buyers? I don't want to see tools implemented that lock them out of the market. Question mark.
Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, yes, the sort of policies that lock first home buyers out of the market are planning regulations which restrict the supply of new housing to the market, and I'm pleased that everyone now except the Labor opposition agrees.
Order. I have a point of order from the Honourable Winston Peters.
The Minister's on his feet and taking Parliament's time up with a statement that has nothing to do with the question. Now, I want you to bring him to order because he gave his answers being yes, and that's it. And stop wasting Parliament's time.
Order. If members want to stay for the balance of question time, I suggest they behave themselves. The question was asked, the response was in order and was being given by the Minister before he was interrupted by the point of order. The Honourable Bill English can continue with his answer.
Mr Speaker, the second policy that locks first home buyers out of the market are very high interest rates, such as first mortgage rates of over 10% when Labor left office, and today they're 5%.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister, did he say in June regarding first home buyers and LVR restrictions that, quote, I'm pretty confident that between the commercial incentives of the banks, the judgment of the Reserve Bank and the influence of the government, that we'll be able to navigate a way where they stay in the game?
Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes. And the Reserve Bank consulted the government regarding its LVR restrictions. The government made its view clear. The government also changed the policies with respect to welcome home loans and KiwiSaver subsidies to ensure that within whatever restrictions the Reserve Bank put in place, first home buyers got a reasonable go. But the government's position has always been that the supply of new housing is much more significant in influencing house prices than the LVR restrictions put on by the Reserve Bank.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Given the Minister's confidence, did the Minister of Finance in fact sign a memorandum with the Reserve Bank that contained no provisions to protect first home buyers?
Mr Speaker,
Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes, and the memorandum would be quite an inappropriate vehicle for that kind of policy. It is a memorandum that sets out the macro-prudential toolkit available to the central bank. It is a memorandum that sets out the independence of the Reserve Bank in using that toolkit and requires the Reserve Bank to consult the government. In fact, it is one of the world's most developed macro-prudential frameworks, and it is up to the Reserve Bank to independently exercise its choices. With respect to house prices, we're focusing on increasing the supply. Unfortunately, the opposition aren't supporting us on that.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Louise Upston.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Supplementary question to the Prime Minister. What progress is the government making to assist first home buyers in the housing market?
Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker.
Order. The level of interjection is now unreasonable from this side of the House. Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, first of all, by doing everything we can to help keep interest rates low as long as possible so that they remain closer to 5% rather than 10% as they were under the previous government. Secondly, we have reached agreement with the Auckland Council to bring 39,000 houses into the market over the next 3 years. We have passed legislation that sets up special housing areas which will enable the government to provide a fast track to councils who want to consent more houses more quickly, and we have changed the policy with Welcome Home Loans and KiwiSaver to ensure first home buyers will get priority from banks.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David
Does
Cunliffe.
the Prime Minister agree with the current Minister of Finance's statement that New Zealand's monetary policy is the best in the world and requires no change? And if so, can he explain why his solution to the housing crisis is to have such low growth that interest rates stay low?
Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
On behalf of the Prime Minister, I do agree with the Minister of Finance. And I'd have to say that's not always the case, but in this instance it is. And as for the member's assertion about low growth, New Zealand's current growth rate is in the top 5 or 6 in the developed world. The answer to housing affordability is not low growth. The answer to housing affordability is a faster supply of more houses on the ground. And after 2 years of intensive work, the government has now secured agreement with Auckland City and has in place the legislation that will enable that process to get underway as soon as possible.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question,
to the Prime Minister. Did he, his existing Minister of Finance or the Treasury ever propose to the Reserve Bank that LVR restrictions not apply to regions with low or no house price inflation?
Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think probably every possible variation of LVR restrictions was discussed between the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, the Treasury and the Reserve Bank as part of the consultation process. However, we kept in mind through those discussions, first, the independence of the Reserve Bank, and secondly, that it's the supply of more houses on the ground that will make the biggest difference. And it's pretty clear that one of the reasons for the doubling of house prices between 2000 and 2008 was planning regulation that restricted supply and bad government policy that drove interest rates to 10%.
Point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Speaker, the question wasn't a general one that asked about every possible permutation. It asked about one permutation, and that was not addressed by the Minister.
The question was adequately addressed. The question was, did he or the Prime
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary.
Order. I'm just ruling on that point of order. The question was very adequately addressed. I invite the member to go back and look at the substance of the question and the substance of the answer to satisfy himself. Supplementary question, Louise Upston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary question to the Prime Minister. Has he received any reports of support for loan-to-value ratios?
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Insofar as by the expression loan-to-value ratios we mean restrictions on particular loan-to-value ratios, yes, I have seen 2 reports. One that says, quote, "We do support loan-to-value ratios. We've been calling for them for ages." And secondly, from another person, "You're wishing to explore the use of a package of macro-prudential measures. You'll get no argument from the Labor Party on that." The first was Phil Twyford and the second was David Cunliffe. And I think he put the second one on his CV.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable
Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister, did his current Minister of Finance ever propose to the Reserve Bank, amongst the many tools that he talked about, that LVR restrictions would not apply to regions with low or no house price inflation? And if so, why was he ignored?
Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the answer to the first question is I understand, yes. And the answer to the second question is that the Reserve Bank Governor is independent. His independence has been a pillar of New Zealand's economic policy for 30 years, and in the end, he made the decision about the LVR restrictions.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Honourable David Cunliffe.
To the Prime Minister, why does the Prime Minister blame the Reserve Bank? The retail banks, the opposition, the general public, everybody else other than his own government for his 5 years of failure on housing.
Order.
Mr. Speaker,
Bill English.
I simply don't accept the member's assertion. interest rates are at 50-year lows, which has made housing, given the elevated prices in New Zealand, has made housing at those prices more affordable than they would have been. Secondly, we've worked intensively, particularly with the Auckland City Council, but also with local government New Zealand, to implement a framework that allows for local decision-making and planning, at the same time as a recognition of the wider economic impacts of runaway house prices. I accept that has taken 2 or 3 years, but that is because of the participative nature and consultative nature of this government, and now we are ready to bring thousands, literally thousands, of extra houses to the market.
That's a long enough answer to that question. What a supplementary question, Materia Turo.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker, tēnā koutou te whare. Will the Prime Minister commit to a large-scale affordable home building program in order to meet his quote of a faster supply of mixed houses on the ground, given that in Auckland, for young families there, the house prices have now risen 3 times the rate of wages in the past 4 years?
Mr Speaker, the answer is yes, and in 2 ways. First, through reconfiguration of the government state housing stock. The government is an owner of $15 billion worth of houses, 70,000 of them. Not only are many of them inappropriate for housing people in serious housing need, many of them are appropriate for more development and densification, and we will be a direct provider of medium density housing to urban markets around New Zealand under that development strategy. Secondly, we're implementing through legislation and local body accords supply measures that will enable something to happen in Auckland that did not happen under the previous government, and that is the building of affordable housing. For a decade in Auckland, no affordable housing was built. In the next 5 years, thousands of affordable houses will be built.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Materia Turo.
If his government refuses to commit to a large-scale affordable home building program, what comfort can he then give the typical first home buyer who now needs to spend 2/3 of their take-home pay to service a mortgage on a start home in Auckland?
Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, in case the member wasn't listening, I said yes to her question, not no. This government is more committed to housing affordability, certainly than the last government, who achieved nothing. And as I outlined to the member, in 2 ways. One, through the government's own direct building and development, through its own portfolio, and second, through the agreements we have with councils, which are now going to enable thousands of affordable homes built that are funded by first home buyers and others, and built by builders, not by government departments.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Materia Turo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Why does his government continue to allow housing property speculators to make tax-free income on their capital gains in housing investments, which forces up prices and locks young families out of home ownership?
Honourable Bill English.
Well, first of all, Mr Speaker, people who trade in houses pay tax on the earnings. If they buy a house for the purpose of sale and they sell it at a profit, they pay the income tax rate on the gains on that house. I think that's a pretty important point. Secondly, a few years ago the government did adjust the taxation regime as it applies to investment property. We're collecting hundreds of millions of more tax from that sector, I think as high as 700 or 800 million more of tax. Thirdly, the most important influence on house prices are not conspiracies of speculators, it is conspiracies of planners who prevent the building of new houses in sufficient quantity to meet the growing demand in a growing economy.
Supplementary question, Honourable Peter Dunn.
Mr Speaker, is the Minister aware of comments during a recent television debate that one of the ways of making first homes more accessible was to reduce the value of everyone's home? And if so, what is the government's reaction to this inane proposal?
Order. Honourable
Well,
Bill
Mr.
English on
Speaker,
behalf of the Prime Minister.
It's the kind of chip on the shoulder vindictive stuff we can now expect from the Greens, and we're seeing more of it.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. When will the government give young families a genuine pathway to home ownership by leveraging the Crown's low cost of borrowing and by using a modern version of the state advances, such as the Greens' Home for Life progressive ownership scheme?
Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, while there is some scope for supporting first home buyers, for instance through welcome home loans and KiwiSaver subsidies, we also should avoid the problems created in other housing markets by large-scale first home buyer grants, which are shown inevitably and always to pump up house prices, therefore making it even harder for first home buyers because government simply subsidises the proceeds of a sale for the seller. So we're not here to subsidise sellers and pump up what they get. We are here. The primary influence, the primary benefit for first home buyers is to increase the supply of housing in a way that matches demand so prices do not race away at 15% per annum. We want to reduce rising prices, not subsidise them.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Given that house prices have risen 3 times the rate of wages in the past 4 years, that the typical first home buyer needs to spend 2/3 of their take-home pay to service a mortgage, will the government simply concede now that its approach to housing has failed to stabilise housing prices, and it's time now for the government to discourage speculation, lead a building program for affordable housing and give young families a genuine pathway to home ownership for them and their children?
Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the member is using measures of housing affordability that aren't actually relevant to first home buyers. For instance, the Roost Affordability Index shows that while house prices have gone up, and that's true, and that's something we want to certainly slow down, while house prices have gone up, interest rates have been so low compared to what they were when her party was in government that housing affordability is roughly the same as it was 6 years ago. Now, the risk many home buyers face is that interest rates will at some stage rise, and they should keep that in mind.
Question number 2, David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance. What